Yeah, I'm power through. So, well, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and reconvene, maybe even a little bit ahead of schedule. It's been a long but very productive day, so we're going to work through these session report outs, do some closing remarks. We may even get out of here a little bit early. So, do I have a representative from each group who can do the report out? Okay. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and start with the first one, that came out of panel one. So,
the national. How can we collaboratively create a national digital strategy?
well, we can start with that one.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'll give you just the highlights, and those of you who are in the group, please feel free to chime in. So the question was, how can we collaboratively create a national digital strategy that puts communities at the center? And we thought the best place to start is actually values, not technology, but values. And to center community-centric values first and foremost. And over the course of the conversation, it became apparent that none of us really thought of a national digital strategy in terms of a single platform that we would all dump our various digital materials onto. That's not what we think community archives are looking for in a national digital strategy, but rather some kind of national governance structure that would involve representatives from community-based archives in making decisions about how to collaboratively share resources with each other. And we thought it was important that this be resource sharing among community archives, so archives that are on sort of equal footing, rather than always thinking of how do community archives get resources or expertise from large institutions, but rather how do we share amongst ourselves. And then we did a very, very basic sort of needs assessment of what kinds of things might community archives be interested in sharing. As you can see, I have pages and pages and pages of notes. But the kinds of things that we thought community archives might be interested in sharing would be tools for narrative and storytelling, right, that include digital storytelling, some kind of centralized registry where community archives could opt in to have themselves listed so that we know who else is out there in our region and nationally, tools for assessing our users and the impact of the work we do, tools for increasing mobility of our digital materials. So how do you make sure that once you digitize something, it's accessible to somebody who's accessing it on a mobile device, which increasingly our users are. And then finally, best practices for researchers using community archives. So we talked about this history of having researchers extract knowledge from our collections and not give any of that knowledge back, not share the published work that they've done, for example, with community archives. So putting online some kind of best practice for those researchers to know how to work with community and community archives, and then getting these best practices into methods classrooms and graduate training so that students are trained then with these best practices. So those were, kind of the 5 major things that we thought a national digital strategy might entail. But again, we stressed that values were sort of the core, not the technology. The technology is important, but the technology changes so rapidly. It's really the values that are constant. And then some kind of governance structure in which community-based archives could collaborate with each other, share best practices, share knowledge among whatever their needs are. And those were just 5 things we quickly came up with, 5 areas that we feel that there are needs for us to collaborate. Anyone want to add who was part of the conversation? Thank you. Do I have the second group come up?
Our group discussed the relationships, bringing the 2 sides together, the community archives and institutional archives. So we covered a lot of area, great discussion, lots of notes. We looked at areas that first of all, why do we need our voices heard, and the significance of preserving our archives, preserving knowledge digitally. Had some really great cases, I guess you could say case studies that several participants gave us. So something really interesting to think about how we present those voices, and then what happens when we have all the rights to digitize and put it out there, and then we have people who, if it's something in an older archives, then people are saying, I didn't really agree to that when I signed for that, or so these kind of issues. So really good case points that were made. And then what happens when documentaries are made from oral history, and then people have the perception that you're going to make a lot of money on that, and how can they get some of that money? So that was really an interesting point that we talked about from several participants. We took a look at the trust relationship between community archives, the participants in the community, and then also institutional archives, the big guys and the small guys. And how can we kind of bridge that gap, and how do we see the individuals in trust, and then how do we all have agreement that we need to preserve our records, but what about that trust? And then we pointed out about compromise needs to be made for storage or preservation accessibility. And then we asked the question, are we digitizing for preservation needs or for accessibility? And different archival repositories have different answers. For ours at the Porch Manor Creek Indians, we would like to do both, but we recognize that all institutions can't do that. We talked about sealing records for a period of time. We also talked about what the community archives want from the larger institutions, taking risk, and physical control versus cultural control, and the significance of the community retaining that cultural control, even though they may give the larger institutions those records, those digital records. Code of professionals, negotiation. And then we came up with several recommendations for the white paper. Am I saying that correctly, Dr. Malik? So several recommendations or suggestions. Again, we looked at really identifying the parameters of physical control and cultural control, and make a decision on who gets to keep part of that, and where does that control lie? Is it with the community or the larger institution? We talked about a developing code of ethics, a recommendation of developing code of ethics not only for the larger institutions, but both the community archives as well as the larger institutions. How to handle cultural control, that larger institutions shouldn't wait for communities archives to approach them, but they could actually reach out to community archives, reach out to communities that are in need, rather than waiting for them to come to them. We also looked at a suggestion of having a formal community buy-in, making sure that the community always has input with the larger institutions. We also talked about overhead and indirect cost, so those kinds of things can be settled up front. How funds are generated over time, and then provide support back to the community and preservation of archives. So those were some suggestions that we ended up with, and I may have left out some, so let me ask my colleagues, did I leave out? It was a very lively discussion, a large group. I really enjoyed it. I could sit with you and talk for hours and hours about this, because it's so wonderful to hear from other people handling records and archives. It's very inspirational to myself and Miss Ellen Obar, because sometimes, as you know, we all, while we have commonalities, sometimes when we work separately in our own little world, we can sometimes feel a little bit cut off from the larger group of archivists and people who are handling records. So I really enjoyed sitting in the circle with you. Mado, that's thank you in Muskogee. I'm just always assuming that you know the language, right? Because we say it all the time back home. But
Hi. So again, I'm Nikki Ferriolo from CLEAR, and I'm going to be talking about some of the conversations that we had at the Revising and Rethinking Inclusivity breakout group. Otherwise, the other thing that we kind of thought about was like specifically revising funding programs for inclusivity and brainstorm some ideas around that. So we kind of started off with John's question from the first panel about what sort of funding opportunities would be most beneficial for your organization, or just envisioning new types of funding opportunities that could be more inclusive. And so the very first thing was said is that it's almost impossible to have a universal program with total inclusion. So, whew, okay, that relieves some of the burden. And so some of the points that were made that could be helpful were having a kind of general template of, having an archive of success stories, and some common themes that were used for successful funding endeavors. Someone pointed out that being a small nonprofit, grant guidelines can be incredibly intimidating, and so any input that funding organizations can provide for someone who's not a grant writer is helpful, and simplification is greatly appreciated. Another thing that was pointed out was once you receive a grant, the reporting burdens. And a point that was made was that this applicant would rather go through a lengthy initial process than have reporting requirements that are too difficult to meet and have a funder breathing down their neck. So one of the interesting points that was made was kind of comparing cultural heritage funding to funding in the arts community, and some of the more experimental models that are coming out of the arts funding community. So for instance, there's one organization called Alternate Roots that allows for audio or visual applications. So for instance, this organization is already generally puts forward podcasts, and so having an audio application was something that actually they could reuse and repurpose. It's also having these visual and audio applications allowed for opportunities to actually build community through the grant writing process or through the application process. Another example that was given was an arts organization that uses their application to has applicants turn their application into a website, actually. And so there's something that productive that comes out of this process and the labor that it takes to put forward a grant application. And then another thing that was requested was grants that are people-based and staffing grants. Something as simple and broad as just paying for a paid intern, someone to do kind of the catch-all work, which is great experience and lets interns or lower-level staff kind of get exposure to all sorts of different activities within an organization without defining what those activities are ahead of time, so that both the organization and the new employee can kind of learn on the job. And then kind of one of the big trends that Joel was there for the conversation, which was wonderful. And Joel pointed out that there's kind of been lots of feedback and trends about kind of bigger, simpler programs that are more inclusive. And that the more that funders can tap into like what is authentic, what is organic, the better, instead of kind of giving set prescribed guidelines and determining what is important to fund so much. So then we asked kind of the question, kind of coming off our earlier conversation about guidelines and how we kind of grant makers can use guidelines to incentivize certain behavior with grantees. And so we asked, like, what behaviors would you want to see rewarded? What behaviors should be rewarded? And so kind of the number one answer seemed to be community relationship building and community engagement. It was pointed out that sometimes to really have a successful community archive, it takes years of community building. We had one example of taking 8 years just to get a curriculum into one classroom. And how community organizations, especially ones with kind of a teaching and social justice mission, can benefit from these longer grant arcs instead of these shorter periods. We then also kind of just asked the general question about ways to rethink inclusivity. And so one thing that was pointed out was the importance of kind of seeking out the community and making them care. And we kind of thought about, like, what are those communication channels that are important to tap into? And so social media, for better or for worse, and then various meetup groups, ways of, like, getting community together in person. And then also like groups for smaller nonprofits where they can communicate and talk to one another. I'm sure they exist, but dissemination channels for bringing people together. We also asked the question about if you do go to conferences, what conferences do you go to? Like, how can funders find you? And most of the answers that we received were actually subject-based conferences and topical, which is a little bit trickier since people like Joel and I tend to go to these, like, cultural heritage funding or archive conferences. So it's interesting to think about how we can potentially tap into those communities. And then finally, we kind of closed with a conversation about, and this is me kind of taking advantage of the opportunity, to talk about these new DLF toolkits that we're creating for CLEAR and for applicants who are looking to have more competitive proposals, particularly from smaller organizations. And so we kind of I asked what's needed. Do you need help with project planning? Do you need help with, like, finding collaborative partners? And rattled off a bunch of things. And the response was all of the above. So, but to pay attention to the fact that when you're working with community organizations, you're dealing with different education levels, you're dealing with different age ranges and generations. And so if we are going to put forward toolkits, they should be toolkits that kind of reach all of these different age groups that will be needing information on this. The other thing that was pointed out was that it's helpful to have these toolkits early because it takes a lot of time to plan and implement a framework. So you get the toolkit, and then you actually have to think about how to implement it, have a strategy, and it could be just 2 years down the road before you actually get to apply. So time is of the essence. Another thing that was pointed out was it's helpful if grant makers in some capacity could provide periodic follow-up, just because when you're a volunteer or when you have, like, all of the tasks that you're juggling, being from an organization with a small staff, it's easy for opportunities to fall through the cracks. And then the final suggestion was that it's helpful to have a personal touch. It's helpful for people like Joel and I to be here talking to you. And then even if we can't, just something, it was pointed out, something so simple as having our pictures on the website so people know who they're dealing with. So is there anything that anyone would like to add from the group? Okay, well, thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. And it sounds like the afternoon breakout sessions were just as lively and invigorating and interesting as our morning sessions. I think there was a lot of good ideas that have come out of these that we can put into our efforts going forward on this project and into the white paper. As we close things up for today, some things for us to consider. First of all, I'd like to, before we adjourn, thank certainly IMLS for supporting this forum and this project and giving us the opportunity to come together as a group. I'd like to thank our project partners on this project with the planning, and certainly Michelle and Samit for coming to New Orleans to join us and helping to facilitate. And certainly I'd like to thank everyone here today for coming to join and to attend this, to lend your hand and your voice to this project. I think in a way our goal today was simple, to come together to discuss technology, the barriers and benefits that community archives face when we talk about digital heritage. But I think as productive as this conversation has been, it gives us an idea that our task at hand, actually integrating these diverse resources into our digital heritage, is not necessarily an easy task, and we knew that going in. But I think what we've seen today, we've heard a lot of issues that are relevant to the topic at hand, the ideas of technology, capacity, training, ideas of understanding and sensitivity to the community materials that we have. Those are all things that we have to deal with, but one of the things that I think is really an advantage of this forum and these forums that we're doing, it's giving us an opportunity to come together as a group to discuss these. And one of the things that I've heard throughout the day, comments from everyone, is how wonderful it has been to come together, hear what other community archives are doing, hearing what their issues are, what their needs are, but also being introduced to each other so that we can all go away from this and work on some of these partnerships and work on this collective voice that we're trying to bring together. So I think that is going to be one of the great things that comes out of this project and certainly out of today. And this actually gives us a good lead into this project going forward. And so the next forum is going to be in early May of 2017. It's going to be held at the Evanston City Hall, Evanston, Illinois, outside of Chicago. And the focus of that particular forum is going to be on collaboration and networks, benefits for community archives, libraries, and museums. And I think we can take a lot of the discussion that's come out of this forum today and use that as a lead into this upcoming forum. I'm going to encourage everyone to keep abreast of this project. Diversifyingthedigital.org is the project website. So a lot of the discussion that we've had today, the recordings are going to go onto this website so that you can continue to keep in touch, continue to see what these discussions are going forward. And we hope that everyone here can continue to be a part of this family that we're forming with this interest in community archives, technology, digitization, and inclusion. I'm going to open it up one last time for any last questions, comments, or anything before we adjourn for today. Is there anything we haven't discussed? Yes, Deidre.
Thank you so much for organizing this. It was so beneficial.
So thank you. Thank you. As we finish up, Michelle, Samit, Kara, anything I'm leaving out? Anything we've left off for today? Well, we'll adjourn with a couple housekeeping items. We had a list for those I was able to put on the Eventbrite invitation. If your name wasn't on that at the back table, I'll have a printout of that. Please include your name and your contact information as we continue to send out information about this. We can keep you in the loop on that. For those who traveled outside the greater New Orleans area, and even for those who parking, I'll be sending out an email with reimbursement information so that we can get that information back to you. I'll send that form out tomorrow or Friday. Ask that you return that by February the 3rd, but I will say this, the sooner you get it back, the sooner you get reimbursed. So the onus will be on you. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope to continue this conversation. Keep